Let's turn our attention to the Black Lives Matter protests that continue to fill streets across the globe and have some calling for defunding or outright abolishing police forces. Police use of unnecessary and sometimes deadly force, clearly an issue. We see them on the viral videos. Remember when we didn't have phones in our hands? Remember we couldn't record in the moment? Likely there were violent episodes back then. We just didn't share them a million times over on social media. So where do we go from here? What should happen next? Good questions for our next guest, who says there are simple, commonsensical changes to the way that we train police that could help de-escalate interactions between police and the public. Very pleased to welcome Steve Poplawski, a retired police officer and director of Step Training, Inc., use of force trainer. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Jody. I appreciate it.
I'm so fascinated by this because there are people, it's a very polarizing topic. Obviously, there are people that are like, this is enough already. The police, everybody's a problem on any force, anywhere. We're seeing it. Coast to coast here in Canada as well. We've got lots of issues right here. We don't even need to look south of the border. And yet when we do, the systemic racism within the police force in the United States seems to be exponentially heightened. What do you see when you're looking both here in Canada and in the United States when you're watching incidents such as the murder of George Floyd?
Well, I think where I wanted to start with this conversation is really just looking at the Ontario use of force model. So I'm an retired Ontario police officer, so my experiences are from Ontario, but I think what we're talking about is going to go right across the nation. And that is, we need to change the way that we approach training and include an area that we have to, up until now, we really haven't included, and that is the internal factors going on, not just the external factors.
Okay,
and
so the internal factors as you experience them versus what you think they should be like. Could you lay that out for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So right now, the Ontario use of force model that we're working on, the last change made to it was in 2004. So if we think back to 2004, I mean, that's when we had like VHS machines in our houses watching movies and stuff, and it really hasn't been updated since that time. There's been no changes. So what we're looking at is, from a modern point of view, a modern perspective, we need to start factoring in the internal factors of officers. So what we are looking at is dealing with a decision-making model that focuses in on the internal monitoring the officers have, as well as the external monitoring that they must do within their job in their profession. So it's about, when we deal with training, it's about looking at what's going on inside the officer themselves, as well as the tools and the skills necessary to do the actual job itself. And I think when we look at some of the things that have been happening in terms of an escalated experience that's going on, some of that could probably be traced back to the internal factors, not the external skills.
Okay, so can we put some real words of action into your explanation there? What needs to change?
So what we need to do is, I think, when we talk in terms of use of force, in my own personal opinion, I think that might be a dated term now. Like, it's what we're looking at is critical incidents. Is how do officers interact with the public, interact with people, and deal with the incident. And with the goal is always to deal with that incident in a nonviolent way, to have it end in a positive outcome.
Of course it is. And with all due respect, Steve, of course it is. However,
yes,
we are seeing viral videos now from coast to coast. We've seen a wellness check on a nurse in the interior of British Columbia result in the officer dragging this poor woman and kicking at her head. We've seen the viral video from Alberta of an older gentleman who was clearly out of sorts, who was tackled to the ground, a pool of blood forming around his head, and the officer puts a knee to his neck. Like, these are more than just, we all want it to be okay. Like, people are angry about this now. Right.
So traditionally, police training focused on external skills. So it would be like, we could talk about the particular pin that an officer is using, how do you apply handcuffs, how to use the certain tools, and it talks to the external piece. And I think
Right.
what's happening is we've gotten away from, or we haven't really addressed the internal pieces. And we were part of a research project which was run through the Toronto University of Toronto on behalf of the Ontario government that was looking at the evidence and the science behind training, and specifically training in de-escalation and the Ontario use of force model. And
What did you learn from that?
well, we released two reports. The first report that we released was in June of 2017, and it was a comprehensive report that was evidence-based, where we looked at experts not only in Canada, the U.S., right across the world. And we had people from all different areas, from the medical field, from the policing field, research experts, people that were experts in all kinds of different areas came together and gave their opinions, their professional opinions on some of the things that we need to look at in terms of training. And that report
Like
was
what?
released then. Well, we looked specifically at de-escalation and how is it trained. So, for instance, is there a common definition of what de-escalation is? We use that word, and it's thrown around all over the place now, in all different types of areas, not just policing. Even with government to government, they talk about a need to de-escalate situations. And you'd be hard-pressed to find an actual definition that is applied consistently across the board, not only in policing, but in other areas as well. So we found one of the things is not that the officers weren't training in de-escalation, is that there wasn't a lot of commonality in what that meant. What is de-escalation?
See, I like the fact that you're pointing to I like the fact that you're pointing at what's going on inside the mind of the trainee. Like, what are your triggers? What are your stresses? Why do you want to be a police officer? Why are you in law enforcement? Because there are great people working really hard, putting themselves in harm's way every single day to protect fellow citizens. I'm related to a Vancouver police officer. My cousin Cindy is an officer, and this whole temperature that is happening around the battle between citizens and the police force is painful to her. And yet she acknowledges that there are some who get great power from wearing a badge, and that power, they get drunk with it. And they misuse it. And it's how do we mine out those who are misusing that power while supporting those who are really, truly becoming police officers for the greater good?
Well, when we looked at internal competencies, when we looked at dealing with officers and looking at their ability to do certain things internally as well as externally, we looked at areas like their overall health status. Your personal health status affects how you interact with other people and do your job. There's things that happen. An example I would use is if you just had a new baby, your sleep's probably not what it should be. So maybe that might have an impact on how you deal with certain things in the job perspective now, and it's coming from that internal factor, which is a lack of sleep. As an example,
that's a great point. Yeah, that's a great point.
We also looked at your own awareness of stress. Are you able to recognize when you yourself are having stress reactions, when you yourself are under a great deal of stress? Are you able to recognize that? Because we know that once you start recognizing your own stress and your own triggers, you're less likely to act on them. You're more likely to find a way to resolve it once you're aware of it. So our officers, and can we train officers to be aware of their actual stress responses and be aware of their own stress? Another area would be emotional regulation. Is it assumed that just because you put a uniform on that you know how to regulate your own emotions? Should we assume that, or should that be a trained response? Yeah. I think it needs to be trained, and that's when you look at the Ontario use of force model as it stands right now. There's nothing on it that talks to the officers' internal processes. It doesn't speak to that. It speaks to external facts, and on some level, it speaks a little bit to the subject's issues or the subject's emotional triggers, but it doesn't speak to the officers themselves. And a concept that we like to talk about in the training that we offer is that we refer to it as the U factor. So what we mean is no matter what the call is, no matter what tools you decide to do, it all comes from you. You're the one that's making those decisions. You're the one that's deciding what to do next or what tool to access or what resources. So if you're in a highly emotional state, how do you do that? And I don't think the current training right now, as it stands, actually gets into that right now. It's not looking at that piece. So
Right.
I'm not an advocate for getting rid of current police training. I'm an advocate of adding another area, a critical area that up to now I don't believe we've addressed properly. It's
Adding that
on
layer.
the internal piece. And I think
Yeah.
that might answer some of these things that we're seeing. It might answer some of these escalated states that we're seeing on these viral YouTube videos. We might see this, have a reason for that. We might be able to go, now I understand what's happening. How do we train so that we prevent that from happening in the future, or we change that process? So
I think that's a very
not about-
salient point you bring to the table. And also, the piece of that has to come with consequence for those who act outside of the training that is then layered on. Because there's a lack of being held to account from a public perspective. Those who act out in a way that could be triggered by any of these things that you've put on the table here, which I completely agree with. The consequence piece is part of it. Unfortunately, I'm up against the clock here. Stephen, I'd love to talk to you again, though. Fascinating stuff.
That's great. I really appreciate you having me on.
People can find out more where? Do you have a web address for us?
Yeah, if they want to, the reports that I spoke about, we also have an actual decision model for police encounters. It's a model that was meant to come into place and replace the Ontario Use of Force model. You can find all that material at heartlab.net, which is through the University of Toronto. HARTlab.net. And if you go into the policy recommendations, you'll see the reports that I mentioned.
Excellent. Stephen Poplawski, thank you so much for doing this.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
If you want to hear more, subscribe to The Roy Green Show on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you find your favorites. And if you like what you hear, leave us a review and tell a friend. I'm Roy Green. Have a great weekend.